All right, so the topic today is, why is it that Hazal did not institute a particular period of mourning to commemorate the revolt of Bar Kochba, which was crushed eventually by the Romans, and which led to what we can describe without exaggeration as a Shoah, mamash, a Holocaust. It was the first Shoah really in the Jewish people's history, as we're about to see in a moment. You would expect that in the wake of such an event, which led to the destruction of much of the country and the loss of life, etc., you would think there would be at least one fast day or a period of mourning, but that's not the case. We don't find Hazal speaking about such a thing anywhere. And the question is, why not? So first of all, let's begin at the beginning. The first source on the first page in front of you is a quote from the Talmud Bavli Masechet Yevamot, according to the original Nusach that appears in the Igeret of Rav Shira Gaon. He writes, 12,000 Talmidim hayu lo l'Rabbi Akiva v'chulam metu b'perek echad. According to other versions of the text, he had 24,000 students, because it says there are 12,000 pairs of students, which is a rather strange formulation. If you want to say 24,000, just say 24,000. Why say 12,000 pairs? At any rate, he had many, many thousands of students. And according to this source in Masechet Yevamot, they died during the period between Pesach and Shavuot, then Pesach la'atzeret. And yet, we do not hear of any fast day that was set for those days, or any period of mourning. You may ask, what about the fact that we have such mourning customs connected to Sfirat HaOmer? That's true. Today there are such customs, but Hazal don't speak about this. And the question is, why not? And there is no question that this was a very major calamity that befell the Jewish people, the greatest perhaps that had ever befallen the Jewish people until that time. And there was probably nothing similar or greater until the Shoah in our own time, in recent generations. The extent of the revolt, how successful it was at first, and how disastrous the eventual crushing of that revolt, about that there is no doubt. We know on the one hand that the Romans were surprised and were driven out of the country for a time, and for about 2.5 years, Shimon ben Kochba, that was his real name, Shimon ben Kochba, he was called Bar Kochba, that's a nickname, based on the drasha on the pasuk, Darach Kochav miYaakov, but his real name was Shimon ben Kochba. And he was known as Shimon ben Kochba Melech. Rambam refers to him in this fashion. And he was very successful at first, to the extent that Rabbi Akiva said about him, Den Malka Mashiach. That's what it says in Masechet Ta'aniyot, the 4th chapter in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Rabbi Akiva was so impressed and was very convinced that he was truly the leader of the Jewish people who would lead them into a period of Geula. He said, Den Malka Mashiach, this is the Melech HaMashiach, which eventually proved not to be the case. But this is a very important statement, by the way, this statement of Rabbi Akiva, that the Melech HaMashiach is not a miracle worker. He doesn't have to perform miracles, he does not have to revive the dead or do other supernatural deeds. Why, says the Rambam, how do I know this? Because Rabbi Akiva thought that Bar Kochba was such a person, and he didn't do any of these things. We don't know of any such claim that he did such a thing. This is, by the way, in contradistinction to the Talmud Bavli in the Sechet Sanhedrin, which says that because he wasn't able to do things of a supernatural nature, other Chachamim rejected him as a possible Mashiach. But that's a separate discussion. That's not for today's Shiur. But the fact is, the Rambam follows the Talmud Yerushalmi, and Rambam says, Ben Kochba HaMelech, Bar Kochba, was definitely a candidate to be the Melech HaMashiach, because he was a leader of the Jewish people who fought the Jewish people's enemies. He was successful for a long time. Eventually the revolt was crushed. The result of that crushing, of that revolt, was very great. In front of you I have here in Hebrew some sources based on Roman historical sources. To get an idea of how great the revolt and how successful it was, the Romans, in order to quash this revolt had to bring approximately a third of their total military forces and resources of the entire Roman Empire here to Eretz Israel to quash the revolt. We know that they had here in Eretz Israel to do this 10 or 11 legions, plus many other auxiliary units, out of a total strength of 28 legions. The entire Roman Empire, which was at its height, by the way, at this time, which is one of the reasons perhaps why the revolt did not succeed. Perhaps had our forefathers waited another 100 or 200 years, the result would have been different. At this point in time, we're talking about the year 132, according to the Christian calendar. And the revolt lasted approximately 4 years altogether, a bit less. The Roman Empire was at its height. And they had a total strength of 28 legions. 10 or 11 of those legions, which is therefore more than a third of their total strength, was brought here in order to quash the revolt. What was the result in terms of what the Jewish people suffered? We have sources from that period. We have a Roman historian by the name of Dio Cassius, who writes as follows, that the number of Jews killed in the fighting was 580,000. I repeat, 580,000. That is a huge number, well over 500,000, nearly 600,000. Keep in mind that the total Jewish population of the world was probably not more than 4 million at that time. On top of which he says many others died of disease, hunger, and many others, probably another couple of 100,000, were sold into slavery. So you can imagine the enormity of the blow. He writes also that 50 fortresses, walled cities that had been built as fortresses were crushed by the Romans, and 985 settlements, towns and villages were destroyed by the Romans at that time. At nearly 1,000 yeshuvim. Think about 1,000 yeshuvim today being totally destroyed down to the ground. And this, by the way, is borne out by archaeological evidence. Every archaeological dig in Eretz Yehuda, that is to say from Yerushalayim southwards, the area known as Eretz Yehuda, every single archaeological dig that comes upon the remains of such settlements from that period, in each case they have been found to have been destroyed exactly at that time, and nothing was left. They all signs of burning, ash, everything destroyed, nothing left standing. So the blow was enormous. The results were calamitous, and yet we see no statement by the Chachamim that we are to mourn on any particular day because of these events, except for the following statement, which you find on the second page, the top Gimel, a quote from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Ta'aniyot, Hamisha devarim eruv et avatenu b'shiv'asa b'tamuz v'hamisha b'tisha b'av. Let's talk about Tisha B'av. 5 things happen on Tisha B'av. What are these 5 things? The 4th line, Tisha B'av nigzar avotenu shelo yikansu la'aretz. This was in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. The original gzera, that they would not enter Eretz Yisrael because of the meraglim, the spies. V'harav habayit barishona v'ashniya. The first and second temples were destroyed. V'nilkeda bet ter, or bet tor, which is Beitar, at that time, which is the last fortress, the last holdout of Bar Kochba and his soldiers and his army. That was destroyed according to this Mishnah on Tisha B'Av. V'nechlasha ha'ir, which is an event which is not entirely clear to what it refers, so we won't go into that now. So we see the Mishnah does mention the fall of Bet Ter or Bet Tor, which is Beitar. But it doesn't mention anything about the period between Pesach and Atzeret, between Pesach and Shavuot. There's no fast day, there's no period of mourning that was instituted by the Chachamim at that time.
What's Beitar? What is Beitar?
Beitar. The place you know today is Beitar.
Oh.
If you pronounce it correctly, it's Beth Tor. Beth Tor is it's 2 words which condensed into 1 word. And the facts were known to the Chachamim. It's not as if the Chachamim didn't know. They lived through these events and they were very aware of them. We see here in the next source, Ot Daled, on page 2, from the Yerushalmi Masechet Taniyot, Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Elai. Rabbi, this is Rabbi Akiva. was Doresh as follows, the Pasuk, Hakol Kol Yaakov, V'hayadayim Yedei Esav, Kolo Shel Yaakov Tzoveach, Bima She'asu Lo Yedei Esav B'Veitor, or B'Veiter. In other words, the Jewish people cry out because of what Esav, the Romans, did to them in Bet Tor. And then he goes on to explain. Kerem Gadol Haya Adrianus Harasha. Adrianus was Hadrian, the emperor of the Roman Empire. No, I can't. I'm doing the best I can. Hadrian was the emperor of the Roman Empire at that time. He had a huge amount of land which belonged to him here in Eretz Israel, between Tiberia and Tzipori in the north, in the Galil, and he built a fence around his property using the dead soldiers, the bodies of the soldiers of Beitar, to cover that entire area. It was a, so to speak, not a living, but a dead fence constructed of bodies, and they were not to be buried for a long time. That was eventually what happened. They were eventually allowed to be buried, and that's when the bracha Tov HaMetiv was added to Birkat HaMazon, which is connected to the idea of Nichum Avelim, which is a separate discussion, but that's what happened at that time. In other words, the results of that war, of that revolt, were disastrous. The one after the end, the bracha Tov HaMetiv at the end of Birkat HaMazon. The bracha we say after Bnei Yerushalayim. Till that time, there were three brachot.
Okay.
There were three brachot in Birkat HaMazon, right? Hazal et hakol, al haaretz v'al hamazon, b'nei Yerushalayim. That was it. That's why we say Amen. Why do we say Amen after the third bracha? There's a halacha.
As well, no?
Okay, but originally there was only three brachot, and every person who says the Birkat HaMazon, when he says b'nei Yerushalayim, he says Amen. Why? Because at the end of a series of brachot, at least according to certain halachot and Hazal, we say Amen at the end of a series of brachot. So Amen is said at the end of Bnei Yerushalayim because that was originally the end of Birkat HaMazon. The fourth bracha was added at this time when they were allowed to bury the dead of Beitar. And Rambam was also very familiar with these events and how momentous these events were, how much they impacted the Jewish people of that time. He writes as follows in Ot He. Rambam writes in Chot Taniyot. On Tisha B'Av, he says there were 5 things that took place. Chamisha Dvarim Er'u Nigzar ala Yisrael b'midbar shelo yikansu la'aretz. That's what, as we mentioned in the Mishnah, that was when they were not allowed to enter Eretz Israel. At that time, they had to spend 40 years in the desert. V'harav habayit barishona v'ashniya. The first and second temple were destroyed. V'nilkeda ir gedola. Here the Rambam elaborates and explains further. He says, Nilkeda ir gedola, a great city was captured by the enemy. Uvet Tor, that's the Rambam's reading. Uvet Tor haya shema, that it was called Bet Tor or Betar. V'hayu ba alafim uruvavot mi Yisrael. There were many thousands, tens of thousands of Jews in this city. V'haya lahem melech gadol, and they had a great king, a great leader. He's referring to Bar Kochba, of course. V'dimu kol Yisrael ugdolei hachachamim, and all the chachamim, such as we saw with reference to Rabbi Akiva, Shehu HaMelech HaMashiach. They thought he was the Melech HaMashiach. V'nafal biyad goyim v'nergu kulam. But eventually this was not the case. He was killed, and all of his army and all of his people were killed. V'haita tzara gedola kemo hurban HaMikdash, says Rambam. The calamity, the tragedy, the ason was as great as the time of the Churban of the Mikdash. In fact, I would add that apart from the fact that at the time of the Churban, the destruction of the Mikdash in the year 70, according to the Christian calendar, and this time, 60 years later, or a little bit more, in the year 136, apart from the fact that in the first case, in the first event, there was a Mikdash which was destroyed, in the second revolt of Bar Kochba, there was no Mikdash, but apart from that, in every way, the second revolt of Bar Kochba, the results of that rebellion, which did not succeed, were much worse, much greater, much more severe than the results of the first, 60 years later. The number of dead, the destruction of the country, the numbers of Jews that were killed, that were sold into slavery, the fact that after the revolt of Bar Kochba, all the Jews that were left were driven northwards to the Galil and the Golan eventually. All of the southern part of the country around Yerushalayim and further south, etc., and also areas towards the coast were made Judenrein, Mamash Judenrein. These things did not happen in the time of the Churban. So really, in many ways, it was much more severe. The Rambam says it was as severe as the Churban. Mimela, we have to ask ourselves the question: if, as a result of the events of the Churban, we have a fast day, we mourn, according to what the Mishnah says, as we're about to see in a moment, for several days and a week in the month of Av, and we have a fast day, Tisha B'Av, why do we not find any similar event or period of mourning with regards to the revolt of Bar Kochba? You would expect at the very least a special day of a special fast day. We have, after all, the fast day of Tisha B'Av, that's true, and the Mishnah says that this city of Beitar also fell on Tisha B'Av. But we also hear in Masechet Yevamot that the period between Pesach and Shavuot, the period in which we are now, was also a terrible period. It wasn't just the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva who died. There was also hundreds of thousands of other Jews who died. That Baraita that talks about the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva is focusing on the destruction of the Torah world at that time, similar to what we experienced at the time of the Shoah in Europe 70, 80 years ago, when at that time most of the Torah world was destroyed. And there was therefore many who felt that the Torah world was really at an end, that would not recover. We all know this is, Baruch Hashem, not true. But many people, rabbis and laymen, felt that the Torah world would not recover from the blow of the Shoah. And the same was certainly true at that time. But it wasn't just the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva who were killed, who died. Hundreds of thousands of Jews died, as we read. So you would expect at least one day fast, or a period of mourning of a week or something. But we hear no such thing from Hazal. The answer to this question, why did Hazal not set aside a period of mourning specifically for this purpose, I believe can be answered with two separate points which are connected. The first point is something that we learn from the next source on page 2, which is Ot Vav, which is the Mishnah in Masechet Ta'aniyot, which says as follows: Misha nichnas Av ma'atim b'simcha. There are certain things that we don't do from Rosh Chodesh Av, but the real Aveluth, the real mourning period, begins with the week of Tisha B'Av. The Mishnah says, Shabbat shehal Tisha B'Av liyot betocha, the week of Tisha B'Av, asurim milesaper u'minechabes. We are not allowed to cut our hair, trim our beards, etc. during that week, or to wash clothes, etc. Uvahamishi mutarim mipnei kavod Shabbat. I'll explain this in a moment. First of all, I'll backtrack a few words. What is the Mishnah saying? What happens when Tisha B'Av falls on a Sunday? In such a case, there is no Shavua Shechal Bo. There's no week of Tisha B'Av, because the halacha is that as soon as Tisha B'Av is over, all these practices of mourning are at an end. So if it happens on Monday, there's only Tisha B'Av itself. On Sunday, there's just Tisha B'Av itself. If it falls on a Monday, then we have one day of the first day of the week, Sunday, which has that status of the week of Tisha B'Av. The next day is Tisha B'Av, and again it's over. If it falls on Tuesday, the same. 2 days, one day Tisha B'Av, and it's over. The same Wednesday, Thursday, and then the other possibility is that it falls on Friday. Nowadays, by the way, that cannot happen. According to the calendar, the fixed calendar that we have at the present time, that we have had for something like 1600 or so years, Tisha B'Av will never fall on a Friday. But, just one moment, Tisha B'Av will never fall on a Friday. However, at that time, the time of the Mishnah, there was still being Mekadesh the Chodashim Apiyariya, there was still the process by which the Bet Din would receive testimony from people who saw the new moon, and according to that they would announce when Rosh Chodesh was. And then sometimes Tisha B'Av could fall on a Friday. The Mishnah addresses this question: what happens when Tisha B'Av falls on a Friday? If it falls on any of the days of the week, as we explained, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we haven't got a problem. There's no clash between the practices of mourning and Shabbat. Why not? Because you have Friday to get ready for Shabbat. On Friday you can cut your hair, you can trim your beard, you can wash your clothes, etc. Everything's fine. You'll enter Shabbat as a person should enter Shabbat. We are required, according to halakha, to honor Shabbat, to behave in a way, and to dress in a way, and to groom ourselves in a way which is befitting Shabbat. The pasuk in Yeshayahu says, "V'chibadto," that you have to honor the day of the Shabbat and give it and Likdosh Hashem mechubad. You have to call it a holy day and respect it and dress in the right fashion. And we eat special food on Shabbat, as we all know. You can't enter Shabbat if you look like a person who's in the middle of mourning. So what do? You have the rest of you stop fasting on the Tuesday or the Wednesday or the Thursday, whatever day it is, and you prepare for the Shabbat. But if it falls on a Friday, what do? If Tisha B'Av is on Friday, there's no day in between before Shabbat to prepare for Shabbat.
You just said it couldn't be on Friday.
I said it can't happen today, but it could happen in those days.
Oh.
So in those days, what would you do? The Mishnah says, "Uvahamishi mutarim mipenei kavod Shabbat," which means, even though Tisha B'Av is going to fall on a Friday, Tisha B'Av is a Friday, Erev Tisha B'Av, Thursday, the 8th of Av, the Mishnah tells us, you go and wash, you trim your beard, you cut your hair, you wash clothes, you do everything you need to do for Shabbat, so that as soon as the fast is over on Friday evening, you change into Shabbat clothes, and you enter Shabbat not looking like a mourner. That's what the Mishnah says. You're allowed to do these things that you're not allowed to do the rest of the week, even though actually now it's Erev Tisha B'Av. You would think this is the last day that you would do such a thing. You would cut your hair Erev Tisha B'Av. No, but you do because of Kvod Shabbat. What do you see from this Mishnah? We learn from this Mishnah that the principle of Kvod Shabbat overrides this kind of Avilut, what's called Avilut Yeshana. Avilut Yeshana means old Avilut, old type of mourning, which refers to the national mourning that we all practice on certain days of the year because of events in the past, as opposed to what? As opposed to Avilut Hadasha, which is when a person sits Shiva for a relative, for example, nowadays. That's called Avilut Hadasha, which is more severe. Avilut Yeshana is a little bit less severe. It's similar to regular Avilut, but in certain details it's less so. When it comes to Avilut Yeshana, old Avilut, for things in the past, Shabbat overrides the Avilut. Shabbat comes first. That's what we see from this Mishnah. Mimela, we have to ask ourselves a very, very serious question. How can it be, for example, this is a very serious question in my eyes, how can it be the Ashkenazi minhag of not, extending the period of mourning described in the Mishnah, not just for the week of Tisha B'Av, but for 3 weeks, from Yud Zayin B'Tammuz till Tisha B'Av, which must therefore mean that you don't cut your hair and trim your beard for at least 2 or maybe 3 Shabbatot. How does that practice fit in with this Mishnah? It doesn't really. It seems to fly in the face of this Mishnah. This is a very serious question. Even more difficult is the widespread custom nowadays, not just now, for many generations, during Sfirat HaOmer, of not cutting your hair, not trimming your beard, etc., for a number of weeks. Some people do it for 5 weeks almost, others do it for 7 whole weeks. How can you do that if it means that when it comes to Shabbat, you won't be looking as you should, you won't be looking presentable?
Someone who shaves every day can do it Erev Shabbat. Every Erev Shabbat.
Well, I happen to agree with you, but not everybody does. I know that years and years ago I spoke to someone who knew Rav Soloveitchik Tetzal very well, and he said that Rav Soloveitchik said that Lichvod Shabbat in Sfirat HaOmer you can shave. That's true, but not everyone agrees, not everyone behaves in that fashion. We all know that many people during Sfirat HaOmer, many people during the 3 weeks, do not shave, even though they generally shave every day or 2, which means that after 3 or 4 days the person looks very menuval, very scruffy, not presentable. It's not Kvod Shabbat to enter Shabbat in that fashion, but that's what many people do, and this is a very serious problem, it seems to me. The Magen Avraham in Siman Tav Kof Nun Aleph was aware of the problem. He noticed that there's a problem here, because he quotes the Hagahot Asheri, who writes that we do not trim our beards and cut our hair, even Lichvot Shabbat during this period. And he says, I think the reason we do this, the reason it's permissible to act in this fashion, is that we don't cut our hair every week anyhow. So if you don't do it for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it's not very noticeable. All right, well, the problem with that excuse or that explanation is that it's really not satisfactory. Why not? For two reasons. First of all, some people after 2-3 weeks don't look as they would like to look, and they definitely normally would cut their hair or trim their beard, and now they don't do so. Sometimes it is noticeable. But let's say, certainly centuries ago, there were no electric shavers. According to those who believe that a man is allowed to shave his beard, all of his beard, with an electric shaver. I'm not going to the question of shaving now, but for those who say it's permissible to do so, people who do this today, which wasn't the case centuries ago, if you do this today, every day, every second day, after 3 or 4 days, even after 2 days, you look as if you're an avelut. I remember once standing at a kiosk in my neighborhood. I wanted to buy something, I don't recall what it was, many years ago, and a person drove up and parked his car and walked over to the kiosk, and the owner of the kiosk knew who he was, and he said hello, and he saw that he was unshaved. So he went like this, Israelis like asked the question, like, Makara, why are you walking around like that? His response was one word, Ima. In other words, he said, I'm in mourning for my mother who passed away. That's why I'm walking around like this. In other words, a person who's normally seen shaven, even after a few days, it's obvious that he's an aveluth, and that's not kvod Shabbat. So today, certainly, many Jews, even after a couple of days, do not fit the part. They're not prepared for Shabbat. They can't. It can't be something. It's not something you can hide or ignore. Second of all, if we talk about the period of Sfirat HaOmer, where some people do this for many weeks, the question becomes even more acute. So there is a very big question here as to how we find such practices, such customs, which are not from Hazal. Hazal never instituted such a custom, which fly in the face of this principle of Kavod Shabbat coming first. And that is, I think, one reason why we find, or perhaps the central reason why Hazal never instituted a period of mourning which lasted more than a few days. Hazal didn't speak about not shaving or something, or not cutting your hair, or not washing your clothes or something for 3 weeks, from Yuzayin B'Tammuz till Tisha B'Av. Hazal never said that's an Ashkenazi minhag from the Middle Ages, but Hazal never said such a thing. Why did they not say such a thing? Not because they lacked an understanding of the importance of commemorating these terrible events, not that they didn't feel the Jewish people have to remember these tragedies, but rather they knew that in the Torah there are other values, there are other considerations. Another consideration is Kvod Shabbat, and Kvod Shabbat comes first, and therefore the most they enacted was what we call, what the Mishnah says, Shabbat Shechal Liot Tisha B'Av B'Tocha, the week of Tisha B'Av. So therefore, at the most, we're talking about 5-6 days, never more than that. It never runs up against Shabbat. It either happens on a Sunday or a Monday. Even if it happens on a Friday, we prepare for the Shabbat on the Thursday previously. You had a question?
Yeah, the or something like that. Do you?
You're asking what happens to the week of Tisha B'Av when there's no week of Tisha B'Av.
No, the date.
I know what you mean.
On Shabbat.
I understand. Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbat, as it does this year.
Yeah. Exactly.
And we commemorate and we keep Tisha B'Av on the Sunday. Okay. But what happens to the week previous to Tisha B'Av? Yeah. So the standard, the simple halacha is, which is what the Sfaradim and the Temanim practice to this day, is that on such a year there is no Shavua Shechal Bo, there's no week of Tisha B'Av, because there isn't. The Ashkenazi minhag is to declare the entire week before that Shabbat, which is Tisha B'Av, as the week of Tisha B'Av.
9 days.
No, first of all, we're talking about things that apply to the week of. And Ashkenazim add certain things also from Rosh Chodesh, which is again a question, because every time, if you begin at Rosh Chodesh, there's always going to be a Shabbat in the middle. So how do you do these things and not...
You don't want a Shabbat, so you skip a day.
So that's not what people do. People do not cut their hair during those 9 days. In fact, Ashkenazim don't do it for 3 weeks, etc. So there are problems with these minhagim, it seems to me. And it seems to me very clear that Hazal, because of this rationale, because of what it says in this Mishnah about Shabbat coming first, they never instituted any period of mourning which was longer than a few days, so that it would never cause a lack of Kavod Shabbat. That's number one. Number two, yes?
Sorry, can I ask a question? You did mention, you mentioned before Shabbat, Kavod Shabbat.
No, when it comes to the Shloshim, there it's clear from Hazal that a person does not cut their hair or trim their beard for 30 days, even though it does override Kvod Shabbat. In the case of regular Avilut, it does override Shabbat, but not in the case of Avilut Yeshana. That's the point.
Right, but there are some poskim who say for a parent it should be more than Shloshim. It should be
That's true.
3 months. Yeah?
3 months it doesn't say. It says that it should be more than 30 days until a person's acquaintances and friends tell him that, it's enough already, go and get a haircut, go and
So after
shave.
30 days, if somebody hasn't done that,
It doesn't say 3 months, but it could be 6 weeks, could be 8 weeks, depending.
at that stage you could shave before Shabbat probably.
Yes, and it would be a good idea to do it deliberately so, lichvod Shabbat. But yes, but the first 30 days and even a bit beyond in the case of a parent are certainly not, you're not allowed to
That's
shave.
because Kibbud Avayim overrides.
That's right.
Shabbat.
There it's a question of Kibbud Avayim, which overrides Kvod Shabbat. Exactly.
It could be your sister or a child.
No, that's only for a mother or a father.
Oh, okay.
And it overrides Kibbud Avayim even when the parent is no longer around.
Yes, because the whole act of Avilut is an act of Kibbud Avayim. Even though the parent is no longer alive, but Kibbud Avayim, the mitzvah, is very much alive. So this overrides Kvod Shabbat. But Avilut Yeshana, where there's no consideration of Kibbud Avayim, does not override, the Avilut does not override Shabbat. There is another point which I think also was part of the halachic thinking and one of the halachic considerations of Hazal. And that is that they wished to concentrate all the different days of mourning for the different calamities and tragedies that befell the Jewish people. They wanted to concentrate all of this into the month of Av. They did not want to have many different periods of mourning spread throughout the year. In other words, if you look at the present state of affairs, particularly in the Ashkenazi world, you have 3 weeks between Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. Those who keep the practice of not cutting hair and shaving, etc., for 7 weeks of Sfirat HaOmer, that gives you 10 weeks out of the year. Add to that another few fast days during the year. You have more than 10 weeks out of a year, which is approximately 50 weeks, which is therefore a fifth of the year, 20% of the year in a state of mourning. The question is that a normal way to run one's life? I think Hazal understood that this is an unhealthy reality. For a person to be constantly moving from one period of Avilut and having a space in the middle and then having another period of Avilut, etc. Yes.
Aside from the 3 weeks on the Sfirat Omer, what are the other days? How do you get?
Well, you have the fast days of Shiva Sabbat Tammuz itself. You have Asara B'Tevet. You have Shlosha Gimel B'Tishrei.
That's 1 day. Where do you get to 20% of the year?
7 weeks and 3 weeks is 10 weeks.
Okay.
10 weeks out of 50 weeks is a fifth, 20%. Okay? So, I think Hazal did not feel that it was right to make, even though they relate to us, they tell us in Masechet Yevamot that there was this terrible tragedy between Pesach and Atzeret, between Pesach and Shavuot. Nevertheless, they did not institute any mourning during that period. Why? Because they wanted to concentrate, I think, everything in the month of Av. It wasn't therefore in the month of Av we'll just talk about the Churban and this month we'll talk about something else. No, they wanted everything to be remembered for the month of Av, and that's what we see here on this page 2, the top of the page, the Mishnah. What did it say? It said B'Tisha B'Av here Od Gimel. It says B'Tisha B'Av. It says there were 5 things. What are the 5 things? It talks about the Gzera of not coming into Eretz Yisrael, the first and second Mikdash. It talks about Betar, which is Bar Kochba. In other words, that they deliberately joined all these things together at the time of Tisha B'Av. Historically, if you ask me, is it actually true that it was the day of Tisha B'Av that Beitar fell? I would tell you I don't know exactly, and I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't exactly that day. And the reason I say that is because if you look in the Tanakh, look in Sefer Yirmiyahu, the first Mikdash, it seems, was destroyed on the 7th of Av, not the 10th, not the 9th of Av. And yet we don't fast on the 7th of Av, we fast on the 9th of Av. Why? Because we go according to the more recent Churban, which was the second Mikdash, which was on the 9th of Av. But you could have asked, why didn't Hazal say, well, we'll fast on the 7th and the 9th, right? You could do that as well. Fast on the 7th, take a break on the 8th, and on the 9th you'll fast again. Why not? Because that's unreasonable. That's too much of an imposition, and it's an unhealthy kind of reality into which the Jewish people will find themselves. That's not what Hazal thought was reasonable or correct. And so therefore they said, we will fast on one day, Tisha B'Av, and that'll be for the first and the second Mikdash, even though they're not really destroyed on the very same day. And the same thing could well be the case with Beitar. It could be that Beitar fell a week before, or a week after, or 2 days before, or 2 days after. I don't know exactly. But it could well be that it wasn't exactly the day of Tisha B'Av, but again, they wanted to have everything focused around the day of Tisha B'Av and the month of Av. From the beginning of Av, we have the halakha of Ma'atim B'Simcha, that we don't celebrate different things, we don't practice joyous things, practices, events, weddings, and the like during that period. And everything, according to Hazal, belongs, all kinds of avelot should be concentrated in that time of the year. That is why, for example, I think that it's unfortunate that today in Israel, Yom HaZikaron is the day, either the day before or shortly before Yom HaTzmaut, in the month of Iyar. There's a number of reasons why this is unfortunate. First of all, this year, for example, I heard on the radio some bereaved families who lost soldiers in different wars, who explain how difficult it is for them to celebrate and to feel any kind of joy on Yom Tekumat Yisrael, on Yom Ha'atzmaut, when the day before was Yom HaZikaron. They were busy crying and mourning. It's a very difficult switch to make. So there is a movement now.
Switch from Tisha B'Av to Tu B'Av.
Well, there's more days in between.
First of all, they have a few days in between.
Yeah.
Second of all, Tu B'Av is not really a day when you're required to rejoice in any particular way. It's possible to commemorate the day in some way, but it's not a very overly joyous day. And anyhow, there are a few days in between, so it's not the same situation. That is why there are people today in the country who are there's a movement has in fact come about whereby people are asking that the Yom HaZikaron be shifted to another date. The question is when. My suggestion would be, that's one reason, there are other reasons, I'll get that in a moment, but my suggestion would be that Yom HaZikaron be on Tisha B'Av. That's the normal, most natural, most obvious time to commemorate the falling of our soldiers. And that would by doing so, we would gain on a number of fronts. First of all, and this is perhaps the greatest gain, that the entire country, even those Jews who are very distant today from Torah and mitzvot, would feel somehow connected to Tisha B'Av. Today, people who are, again, not at all connected to Torah and mitzvot, tell them about Tisha B'Av, are you mourning today, are you fasting today? They say, no, why should I? Because of something that happened 2,000 years ago? It doesn't interest me, it's not relevant to me. Which is the wrong answer, but that's how they feel, and there's a reason they feel that way, because they weren't educated, they weren't taught to feel differently. But if that was also the day of Yom HaZikaron, and the country made the official day of mourning and commemoration of Israel's fallen soldiers, etc., then the whole country would feel that Tisha B'Av is a day of national mourning. And then they would also perhaps connect more naturally to some of the other issues that we commemorate on Tisha B'Av, like the Churban and like Beitar, etc. Today, you ask the average Israeli, you ever heard of Bar Kochba and Beitar? Most of them don't really know what you're talking about, and it certainly doesn't make a difference to them. But if Tisha B'Av was the day of Yom HaZikaron, it would make a big difference. People would feel a connection.
Or Yom HaShoah as well. Rafa Megan wanted to make Yom HaShoah.
Yom HaShoah and V'Gvura is another issue, because there's another problem there. That is because that falls in Nisan, and that's also a problem, as has been discussed by many Rabbanim over the last couple of generations. There are other reasons why the juxtaposition of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut is problematic. What happens almost every year is that we do not celebrate Yom Tekumat Yisrael, Yom HaTzmaut on Hey B'Iyar, on the 5th of Iyar. Why? Because obviously it's always because of Hilul Shabbat. So if it falls on Shabbat, okay, it's pushed off to the Sunday, but actually it's not. It's pushed off to the Monday, because the day before has to be Yom HaZikaron, and there are going to be ceremonies at night, and that's going to be on a Motzei Shabbat. So everything gets pushed off by 2 days. So the actual
my birthday, that's a good reason to celebrate.
it's certainly not a reason to mourn, but whether it's a reason for national celebration, I'm not sure. But at any rate, that's one problem. It results in all kinds of issues which would be obviated if we shifted Yom HaZikaron to where its natural and proper place on the calendar, which would be Tisha B'Av. So for these reasons, I believe Hazal deliberately did not institute a particular period of mourning for the events of Bar Kochba, not because they weren't aware of what happened or they didn't care, not because they didn't feel that Jewish people have to commemorate these events, but rather because they knew that having too many mourning type events or periods of mourning throughout the year, as some people have nowadays, is not a very healthy or desirable state of affairs. It's psychologically not a healthy state of affairs. It's necessary to mourn, but to mourn too much is also a bad idea. That's why Rambam says, for example, in Chot Evil, about a regular Avel who is sitting Shiva for a relative. He says, a person should mourn according to what the Chachamim said. 7 days you do this, 30 days you don't do this, etc. But a person who mourns beyond those very clearly delineated periods of mourning of Hazal, Rambam says such a person is a tipesh. Why is he a fool? Because that's the way of the world, and you have to deal with it. You have to give it its proper place, but not more than its proper place. To be constantly living in a frame of mind, or every so often throughout the year, to be put back in a frame of mind of mourning and calamity and disaster, so that it's almost the normal thing to be is in a state of mourning. That's not a healthy proposition. And also due to the consideration of Kavod Shabbat, as we saw in the Mishnah, that when Shabbat falls on a Friday, all the issues of Avelut during the week of Tisha B'Av are set aside on the previous day, on the Thursday, because of Kavod Shabbat. These, I believe, are the two explanations why Hazal did not institute a special period of mourning, and therefore the questions that I asked before remain valid questions about the practices that many people have nowadays of mourning periods during Sfat HaOmer, mourning periods for 3 weeks, etc., because these things run into the problem of Kavod Shabbat, and they also increase the volume of mourning days throughout the year. In other words, Hazal, when it came to such issues, always looked at the bigger picture. They didn't just look at one issue. This is a disaster, the Khurban, or this tragedy, this calamity, and we have to make a big deal out of it, and let's concentrate just on that. They saw the other issues in the world, in the Torah world as well. And Kavod Shabbat is a major issue, and not putting the Jewish people into the wrong kind of frame of mind as a normative Jewish practice. That's also an important consideration. That is what I wanted to convey to you today. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.